Let's have that conscious habit of choosing our love or ourselves at the very core instead of the achievement or the identification to the achievement we may be still doing and being inspired to achieve this and this and that, but we're not identified to it anymore.
I'm Amy Woodall, and this is Conscious Habit, a show from the People Forward Network, teaching you how to incorporate love and consciousness at work, home, and the world at large. You just heard from Arnaud Saint-Paul, a heartful leader, author, philanthropist, and international harmony expert. This beautiful human being created the Heartful Method, which is an approach to leadership that connects people to their heart's vision and helps them find harmony within themselves. In this episode, Arnaud and I go deep about what spirituality means and the importance of loving ourselves. Arnaud went through what he calls an awakening when he was just 13 years old, and he began his quest to find himself. It's a never-ending journey that we should all be working on. Take a listen. And be sure to stick around at the end of the episode where I'll share my 3 takeaways of how we can incorporate Arnaud's wisdom into our work, lives, and the world at large.
In the past 30 years, in order for me to understand myself and this human experience of ours, it came together charts, diagrams that helps me to understand in a very simple way how I am having this experience. How does it work with the others and myself and the mind and the emotions and the ego and all that stuff? And how does it orchestrate itself, right? So that I could have some kind of a visual map that helps me understand where do I go from there? And that started when I was 13, when I woke up spiritually, where, the truth superseded the outer one that was offered to me. And it brought me to that journey of answering the question, who am I? That was an obsession of mine at that time, still is. Well, I have a better understanding of it now. And so that what brought these charts that nowadays I use to help leaders, individuals. I share it with them as an experience, and then they can bring it to their own experience and see what works and what doesn't for them. But so far, 100% success rate in terms of understanding how it all works, what are the processes and what not, and then it's up to each of us to make the conscious choices.
What a gift at 13 to have that, because there are so many people, and I'm sure these are the folks that you're working with too, that they're still living a life of outside in, where they're like, but doesn't life just happen? And then that wires how I respond to it and how I think about it. And what a gift that you were like, I think that this life thing is actually inside out. I think maybe it all starts internally, and how do I dance with it? What a gift to have that so young. And so to be able to go in and work with leaders or individuals they have this longing, right? Of like, there's got to be more than what I think it is. There's got to be more than this achievement and making the money. What are you starting to notice with your clients? What is it that they're seeking, searching for that has them reaching out and wanting to work with you?
So before I answer that question, I wanted to add also, yes, I was on that journey for sure, but I went into finance, I went into technology. I had my time of not necessarily having the whole clarity I would have wished for at the time, right? So it has been a long journey for me. And even with these advantages, so to speak, or this aspect of me that was awakening, I have had my lot of being lost. And being lost could be creating a startup and have it work. That's part of being lost, and not being in my own self and losing myself in whatever activity I may have had. So now to your question, nowadays, I'm fortunate enough to be able to help people that are on a journey. They have recognized that there is something else. There is something beyond their own understanding their mental understanding of life, and they are looking for a solution that makes sense to them. So they tend to resonate with the premises of what I am offering, which is that we can live our life through our heart. We can live in harmony with ourselves. They may have already some spiritual understanding of life, but it's not necessary, but it helps, or it helps deepen that aspect if we want to. But it's more importantly, I guess, they already recognize that it is time to let go of a linear way of prehending life, meaning coming from the mind, the ego, etc. And there must be another way. And that other way is one of the heart, which is a, one that will always be multidimensional or holistic or collaborative. And it's another way of saying it's going from the I to the we or to the one. And so that method of mine and the books I wrote is all about helping the reader or the person that is experimenting the method to have that journey from I to self, which are the two aspects that we hold in ourselves. I being the mind, self being the heart. And both exist. Let's not forget that other aspect of ourselves, which is the love that we hold for ourselves.
I want to break down a couple of the words that we're using just for people who might be like, well, what does that mean? How do I apply that for people who are maybe early on in their seeking, if you will? First is one, it's interesting. I've had some people come to me and say, when you say spirit, Amy, what does that mean? So I'm curious to hear from you, Arnaud, for the person who's maybe early on their seeking journey. How would you explain that to them?
It's a very good question. Let's say that we forego this idea of spirit or spirituality and we look at our life, this moment, right? The one you are listening into now or us talking. And in this moment, there is I, right? Nobody can say otherwise. There's always I there. But underneath that I, if you listen intently, there is a silence. For that I to emerge, there is silence, peace, love that is there. This is the core essence, on top of which exists I and all the life that I'm living. And so it's a bit like the white screen at the movies, right? On top of which is the story and the characters and all that. So that's what we're talking about here. That's the pure, undifferentiated, unconditional love or light or peace or whatever you want to call it, doesn't matter. That is the canvas on top of which you are creating your life.
I love how you put that. It's almost like it's the foundation of everything else that we build. And to be able to ensure that we know how to tap into, how to connect with that foundational part of ourselves, it's what makes everything else sweeter. And I think for a lot of leaders and people who are likely listening to this, maybe they thought that that joy, that peace, that happiness existed outside of themselves. So they chased it. Let me go make more money. Let me buy that nice new car. You know what? I'll be happy when I have that nice new car or that bigger house. I need the bigger house. And then what they find out is they get it. It's so temporary because what is new eventually becomes old. And then we're chasing again and chasing again. And that exhaustion sets in. And they come to a place where they end up finding people like you or myself. And they say, I'm so tired. How do I find this? And I love that you're like, it's beneath the noise. It is what is. It is the foundation. And you can go achieve, but let that be the icing, not the cake. Let the cake be that connection to self. Would you then say, because I am hung up, obviously, name of this podcast is Conscious Habit. I love the idea of just becoming a more conscious being. I actually think it's our greatest contribution to world peace is to work on loving the hell out of ourselves first. So, what does consciousness mean to you?
So before we get there,
I love this.
sorry
Draw
again.
it back, Arnaud.
One very interesting aspect of what we just said is that it's not anymore about achieving, it's about easing into oneself. So there's no effort involved, but to allow ourselves to lay back and feel the support that is that love, that pure love that we are already. So we have chosen not to be that. Awesome. So let's make another choice, right? And that's a very key aspect because you were talking about conscious habits. Let's have that conscious habit of choosing our love or ourselves at the very core instead of the achievement or the identification to the achievement we may be still doing and be inspired to achieve this and this and that. but we're not identified to it anymore. We're at the core, right? On our foundation. So that's what I wanted to add to that. Consciousness is the nature of this presence and all that is around it, which is part of it anyway. In order for consciousness to know itself, it had to create the other, this idea of separation that we are in this world, including the objects that are surrounding us. This is a consciousness too, the object. It's a very slow one and seems to be very dumb. But the bottom line is that sense of separation helps me to understand myself, to define myself, to have the necessary contrast, to allow this consciousness to know itself. But again, the very canvas on top of which all this exists is the white canvas, so to speak, that is undifferentiated, that's pure consciousness, that is what it is, as it is, nothing else. But then all of it.
It's the awareness of self and beyond self. And I have this equation in my mind, which is it's terrible to even say equation for those listening. I know you can't see me, but I'm using quote marks. But I think of consciousness like this. It is presence, it is awareness, it is ownership of, sort of how we play into that. It is all of that minus ego and understanding where ego kind of comes to play and paints this picture. And then I also think that it's where is that the love piece of it? Like, how do we amplify it by love? But I think overall, I love how you said it. It's just the awareness of all that is around us.
But the ego is also consciousness. It's just, what we call ego is a process of identification, which involves consciousness for it to work anyway, right? But it's a choice we're making to identify to this or that, whether it's a role or it's a Mercedes or it's whatever role I want or action I want to have in the world. It is a play of consciousness. Do we want to keep that play on autopilot or choose otherwise this infinite presence of oneself, being in the now moment, in that specific space, and be true to ourselves 100%? That's the choice we have to make. And it's what we would call a conscious leader of his own life or his business or whatever. Then having the conscious habit of making an intentional choice of one aspect or another of ourselves.
I think when people are in their ego consciousness, which I want to dig into that too, when people are living life from ego and identifying with ego, they often don't know it, right? They don't know it until that lost feeling comes in. And the lost, if you are listening to this and you're like, I feel stuck, I feel lost, that is so good. Lean into that, because that means that there is change coming on the other side. I think that we have to get really uncomfortable often. Like, you kind of have those moments of uncertainty that allows us to be propelled into that better version of us, or that better identification of who we are, really more from the spirit side than the ego side. And so I wrote this down when you mentioned it, because I thought this is going to be really good to dig into for our listeners. Ego versus heart. How do I know when I'm living or leading an ego versus when I'm living and leading from heart?
Heart is love. It cannot be measured. It's infinite. It doesn't have any shape or form. It is there. That's the experience I have of love anyway. And so the heart is the place of abundance and of, again, unconditional, infinite aspect of ourselves. The contrast of it is the ego that lives in a world of finite, where everything is measurable, everything is segregated. So how do I detect I'm in my ego? Anytime I am having a thought that is limiting, or an action that is measuring something, or help me to be confirming that I am in a finite world, I am in the ego. In other words, each time I am identifying with something. So I have what in my method, there is the triangle of awareness. Imagine a pyramid. And on that pyramid, you have I am that I am, which is the core we were talking about earlier. And then on top, we have I am this. I am this means I am Arnaud. I am Arnaud is already an identification to this body, to this name, and this action in society, right? On top of that, there is I am this with. So I am the father of my daughter. And this is a further identification because it involves a third person. And then I do, which is the top of the triangle. So each time we are in the upper three levels, we have four levels in total, we are in a space of identification, and we choose to most of the time, actually. We have the opportunity to be aware of all the levels at the same time, but we can also choose to say, okay, I am here, whichever the four of them, and it may be an identification to something that therefore triggers a forgetting mechanism of all the rest. I am absent to myself on many, many aspects, but to that one to which I choose to identify, to engage with, but not from a place of beingness, from a place of being that, just that. We have the choice, again, always. It seems easier, of course, to see a shiny little thing and to go and look at it like the butterfly and say, oh, that's amazing, I love it. That's identification, that's ego. Or to be in the peace of oneself, in the love of oneself, and from that place be inspired to maybe look at this and that and do this or do that. But it's a very, very different starting point. It's an inspired one.
And I like the love abundance, which means ego scarcity. There's only so much room. And I feel like for me personally, when I am in my ego, what I can tell is that that's when my judgment really creeps in. And my ego loves to talk about how either I am better than or worse than everyone around me, right? It becomes sort of this internal judger. And then I have a choice. Do I believe it? Do I listen to it? Or do I lean back into that foundational part, which is infinite love, acceptance, peace? We all came on the planet with that, right? None of us came out of the womb thinking, man, my butt is too big. None of us thought that. Like we all were at total peace with ourselves and the world around us. So it's certainly this learned behavior, this ego. And I'd love to hear from you, Arnaud, as you're, going around the world. Arnaud is actually in France right now.
Yes, I am.
As you're going around the world and teaching leaders, what effects have you been able to see in their organizations if they choose to lead from ego? What's the negative effects on their company, on their people, et cetera?
So ego is a masculine principle, while the being is a feminine principle at the energy level. And so when we use our ego too much, we tend to foster, and from a business standpoint, and the same thing from an individual standpoint, but from a business standpoint, we tend to foster the resistances after which we are going. So in other words, I'm going to compete and we're going to change the world, and these monopolies, we're going to change them, etc., etc. That makes the adversity stronger because that's what you are looking for as the ego. You're looking to be strong and be at the tip of your arrow and change the world, etc. Well, instead of, if you look to balance between the masculine and the feminine, between the doing aspect, which is important, and the being aspect, which is also important, all of a sudden, by choosing a direction, right, and a vision where the whole system needs to go, and allow the feminine to catch up and bring about all the different aspects that are needed for this vision to happen, you are in a much stronger place. So I was on the Nile 2 weeks ago and worked with 60 change makers on a cruise on the Nile. And it was amazing to be able to witness that. At the beginning of the cruise, the people in the group were all about, we're going to change the world. There's that company and that company that are doing wrong, and these ones, they're going to take over, etc. So let's change it. And obviously, within the group, as well as outside of the group of the boat, nothing was really working. Nobody was actually communicating, and they had difficulty to find the right solutions for themselves. After a little while working with them, balancing the masculine and the feminine, using a one-on-one conversations to disconnect people from certain identification systems, they started to, harmony and coherence started to take hold. In other words, the discourse was dimmed down related to changing the world, etc. And at the same time, people were finding faster solutions and everything started to work on its own in an expansive way. So it's very, very powerful. And we're not talking about adding more women, etc. That's not the point here. It's really the energy of the groups in general and companies in general that will tend to be more masculine than feminine. And there is a need of balance between both. That is very important for any project to actually succeed.
This has been reoccurring on every podcast episode we've had where we've interviewed leaders that they have said, I think what's so important is to bring the feminine energy with the masculine and from all sorts of backgrounds. So it's clear that this is a recognition. For me, I think it's part of the collective consciousness. Like we're all kind of being given like, hey, this is what's needed. We are human beings. We are not just human doings, right? But so we've long awarded the doing and the grind. And especially in the US culture, it is all about how hard you're working, go grind, go kill it. And people are exhausted. And it's because we're leaning too far into the masculine and we're forgetting about how beautiful and balancing that feminine could be. So, what a gift to bring to those 60 leaders.
And we might want to also mention for the people that are starting the journey that we all hold both energies inside ourselves. This world is made of the two energies for this to all work. So when we're talking about masculine and feminine energy, whether it is in an individual or a group, both energies are active all the time. But there is an imbalance most of the time on whether on certain topics or on average, right, in the whole group, to take that example.
I appreciate you brought that up because I do think some people might be like, but what does that mean? And how do I do it? If we have a leader that's listening right now who is going, I think I might be leaning more into the doing than the being, what is something, a recommendation you would have for them, a practice? What could they do to lean more into that being, more into that feminine energy?
That's a vast question. Well, if you recognize in your company that apparent need to fight the world, let's put it that way, to put a label to it, right? The first thing that the group or at least certain key people needs to envision or start to take consciousness of is becoming aware of that attitude, right? Number one, but more importantly, pushing the pause button. Let's start with that. Very simple. And pushing the pause button puts you out of this idea of doing, right? We were talking about earlier. And enters the world of maybe from very much afar, because that's too strange a concept yet, into being. And pushing the pause button so that we can start asking questions that helps us to become more aware of ourselves as a group, as individuals. And we have a list of questions actually that I can share with any leader who wants them. But the whole idea is as a group to start a journey towards a deeper connection between themselves, with themselves. Super simple because we're not there yet having them all meditating and all that. That's way too far. But just starting with that is a great first step. And then obviously then we can go deeper into, we have exercises where I can have you feel your feminine energy and your masculine energy and how does that change? And we change lives with that, but that's another step.
Great, simple advice. Just pause. And it's incredible how many people are resistant to that. I know you talked about meditation. You would think that I got paid by some sort of like board of meditators because I would just shout from the rooftops how much it's changed my life. And I love incorporating that into my practice. But there are people who are scared of the idea. And it's because I think they're scared of being with themselves. They're scared of just of the being because it feels so unfamiliar. And it almost feels like I'm not doing anything. I'm being lazy. It's because that hardwiring of if I'm not doing or going, I'm not worthy. right? It's really living from that ego perspective. I have so enjoyed, it's gone by, it's flown by. I just looked up and I'm like, wow, we've been talking for 30 minutes. This has flown by. I'm sure we could do it for another 30, but I would love to give you a chance to share with the audience. How do they find you? How do they continue to learn more and even dig into some of those questions that you mentioned that you have handy?
For the questions, you have to send an email on the website tapuat.com, tapuat.com. It's Hopi name for eternal rebirth, so it's perfectly unmatched. But if there is, we're sharing the Heartful method actually for free. If people wants to dive deeper, you go to tapuat.com/harmony, and there you can do your own workshops at your own schedule, or there are retreats and private guidance if you want to know more, obviously, and to go deeper and faster.
Before we wrap up this episode, here are my 3 takeaways from Arnaud and how we can incorporate them into our work, lives, and the world at large. First off, being versus doing. I don't know about you all, but I spent a large majority of my life really working on finding fulfillment and happiness in achievement. And I thought that when I hit that next achievement, surely like this is when I'm going to feel good. I'm going to feel great. I'll feel fulfilled and like I'm worthy. And it was all BS. And it was because I was more focused on the doing than tapping in to the being. And I really appreciated his take on the importance of starting there first. How do we start with connecting truly on a conscious level to ourself, our being, our spirit, and let that be the cake and achievement be the icing? Number 2, love versus ego. What are you leading with? When you walk into a room, are you trying to get the attention and the recognition or the approval of the people around you by leading with ego? And ego shows up in all kinds of ways. Sometimes it's quiet, sometimes it's loud, but all the time it's keeping us tethered to our comfort zone and judgment. Or are you leading with love, openness and acceptance for yourself so that therefore you can be open and accepting of other people? And lastly, the power of pushing pause. If you're working yourself on trying to be more mindful or more conscious, this is really where you start. Pressing pause. How can I just stop and be present in the moment? One of my favorite books is A New Earth by Eckhart Tolle, and he talks about how we create suffering when we resist the present moment. So pushing pause just allows us to come into the place where we actually live life, which is here and now in this present moment. So press pause, count your breath, and then move on from there. Hey, Conscious Habit listeners, I would love to invite the ladies listening to this podcast to join me in Tulum this November. We have 4 spots remaining for our High Vibe Tribe retreat in Tulum, Mexico. This is a meditation and yoga retreat for all ages, all experience levels. We've done this retreat in the past in Costa Rica, and I have to tell you, it was so soul nourishing. We created sisterhood, we created an incredible practice, and we created a deep connection to spirit. If this is something that interests you, check out the link in the show notes. Thank you so much for listening to Conscious Habit, a show from the People Forward Network. If you have questions for me or our guest, or if you're looking for more ways to live and lead more consciously, head on over to the Conscious Habit community on Facebook and let's keep this conversation going. Until next time, do the world a favor and go love yourself.